You know how that always ends up. Yeah, kablooey. We separated and completed individual circumnavigations of the wrecks. No surprises. By unspoken agreement, we deployed drones carrying squads of roamers. The drones had orders to do close-up scans, while the roamers would offload and poke around anything interesting. Finding a way in wasn't really a problem. One of the hulks had been almost cut in two. The two halves were more disconnected than connected. Only in freefall could such a small ribbon of metal hold together such massive segments. The second hulk was in much better shape, a hole literally big enough to drive a battleship into on a ship this size, barely qualified as a ding. But it's not the size of the damage, it's the quality. We must have taken out something critical. The ships had been drifting for 10 years now. We didn't really expect any kind of activity, but we'd learned caution from previous encounters with the Others, and from a generation of B-movies. The opportunity to examine the interior of an Others cargo vessel was too tempting to pass up, of course. We spent several hours real-time planning for every contingency we could think of. Then, leaving a couple of drones on lookout, we cautiously entered the cargo vessel through the rent in its side. Right away, things got complicated. The ship wasn't, it turned out, just a big cavern. We found ourselves in a large bay or hold or something, forming a pie-shaped section of the interior. That might have been the end of the exploration, except that whatever had taken out the cargo vessel had apparently continued right through the ship, taking out a lot of equipment in the process. At the other end of the cavernous space, we exited into what appeared to be a central corridor, about 100 meters in diameter. It extended from one end of the ship to the other. This certainly explained the large armored doors at either end of the cargo vessels. "This thing is mostly intact," Neil said in a near whisper. "You don't think it could still activate, do you?" "You saw the equipment back there, Neil." I noticed I was whispering as well, but couldn't help it. This had the feel of exploring a haunted castle. Not sure what we took out exactly, but it must have been critical. "Can I have that away?" "Sure, no problem. Bend over, and I'll get my felt pen." "Oh, ha-ha. If we get eaten by ants, you'll look pretty stupid." "Well, that's why we agreed not to do any Sudar sweeps. You were listening, right?" Neil snorted, but didn't respond directly. "I'll head that way, toward the end with the reinforced ring." "No problem. Be careful." We drifted off in opposite directions, doing a visual-only inspection. It took less than a day to reach the ends of the ship. I received a call from Neil. "Hey, Herschel? I'm looking at this huge thingamajig, and I think it's the power core." "Wait, you mean in one piece? And what are you doing in one of the bays?" "It was open. I went in. Soon." I sighed. I'd have done the same. "So what did the attack take out, if that's the power core?" "Maybe a fluke shot through the AI or something, but this is definitely the power core. The size of the conduits kind of gives it away." "Fusion reaction shut down gracefully?" There was a moment of silence. "Well, that's the thing. I don't think this is a fusion reactor." Suddenly, this was more than just a scavenging mission. "Have you found any indications of ants?" Neil responded in the negative. I took a moment to double-check my train of thought, then said, "Okay, we can't put that off anymore. We have to know if we're going to have a problem. So let's move all our equipment out of the hulks. We'll do a low-power Sudar sweep to see if we activate any ants. Once we're sure it's clean, let's take a couple of high-resolution scans of this mystery equipment and see if we can figure it out." Affirmative. Telltales showed Neil's devices vacating the hulks. I ordered mine out as well. Within an hour, we had our scans, but no answers. Not really. Neil popped over so we could review the results. I gestured at a hologram that slowly rotated in the air. "Well, you're right. It's not fusion-based, but it's definitely the power generation facility." I looked at Neil and grinned. "We may have just found some new tech." "Cool," Neil replied. "We should call Bill, I guess." "Are you kidding me? Just hand it over and let someone else get all the glory? No friggin' way." "Aw, geez, Hirsch. I'm getting that bad idea feeling again." "Again? You're usually the source. Me? Since when? I grinned, but didn't bother to reply. The traditional exchange, as always, made us both feel better. But Neil wasn't necessarily wrong. I hoped I hadn't just taken the first steps toward kissing my ass goodbye. 23. Death. Howard, May 2220, Omicron Squared, Aridony. It was the call I'd been dreading for decades. Dr. Onagi looked out the video window at me. I could see from the background that he was calling from the hospital. And there was no warning, Howard. She simply collapsed. We got her admitted, but our efforts were insufficient. I felt my eyes begin to sting and choked it back ruthlessly. I appreciate the call, Dr. Onagi, but I'm a little perplexed that it's you calling me. Shouldn't her children be doing this? Well, Howie maybe. I doubted Rosie would be dialing me up. Dr. Onagi looked to the side for a moment. Well, they very likely would have by now, but per Mrs. Brodier's instructions, we placed her body in stasis immediately, post-mortem. Her children were livid and are seeking legal counsel, as far as I know. I got the impression that you figure prominently in that. They may not be talking to you at all. I stared, stunned. Bridget hadn't given me any indication that she'd changed her mind. I thanked Dr. Onagi for the information and ended the call. I immediately phoned Ms. Benning. Good afternoon, Mr. Johansson. I've just heard about Mrs. Brodier. I'm so sorry for your loss. She's been placed in stasis. Dr. Onagi says that was per her instructions. Has something happened? She changed her will a few months ago. Normally, I wouldn't be able to discuss this with you, but she specifically instructed me to read you in. Ms. Benning reached off screen for a moment. And according to EBAR, her children have just filed an injunction to force the hospital to remove her body from stasis. This is not unexpected, and we already have countervailing filings in place. There will be a hearing, for which you should make yourself available. I'll keep you informed. We exchanged a few more bits of information, then she disconnected. I sat back in my beach chair, staring into space. Bridget was dead. I should be a useless puddle on the floor. I had no doubt that I would be soon, but the unexpected news about her turnaround on the replication issue had thrown me for a loop. Well, I could make myself useful while I was still in one piece. I built scanning equipment from the information Riker and I had gleaned. Time for an inspection. The hearing was relatively informal, held in the judge's office rather than the courtroom. Howie, Rosie, and Leanne sat to one side of the room, and Ms. Benning and I at the other. Dr. Onagi, representing the hospital, sat in a more neutral, central position. Judge Ulrich Katz silently scanned the documents in front of him for a few more moments, then looked up.
Issues with the last wishes of decedents are always difficult. When surviving loved ones...
He's not a loved one, Rosie interjected. The judge stared at her silently, and Leanne put a hand on her arm. Order being restored, the judge continued.
When surviving loved ones disagree about the specifics. But this court cannot make assumptions about the decision in advance of the actual trial. Decanting the decedent at this time will effectively give the decision to the plaintiffs, regardless of the outcome. Whereas if the decedent is left in stasis, she can still be decanted should the decision go that way. And conversely, allowing scanning before a decision is rendered cannot be reversed. Therefore, I will not grant the injunction to have the body decanted immediately. Dr. Onagi, you will maintain the body in its current state, and you will not allow any other operations to be performed on it until otherwise ordered by this court. The judge didn't bang a gavel. I'd been half expecting it. Of course, my experience with court was 100 years out of date, from the wrong continent, on a different planet, and came mostly from TV anyway. I stood up and looked over at Bridget's children. The girls were rigid with the effort of not looking my way. Bridget's son, Howie, glanced at me and shook his head minutely. I took the hint. We let them exit first, then followed. I looked at Ms. Benning and raised an eyebrow.
She opened her mouth to answer, did a small double take, and smiled. Mr. Johansson, I've known intellectually for some time that you were walking around in an artificial body. After all, it's not only germane to this case, but has also been the subject of much gossip. Especially the nature of your, relationship with Mrs. Brodier. Miss Benning blushed slightly. But I've just now consciously realized that I'm not talking to a live, biological human being. I'm impressed at the verisimilitude. I smiled sadly. Thank you, Miss Benning. We Bobs have been putting a lot of effort into getting the androids as believable as possible. And to answer the not quite unspoken question, there's no sexual component to my relationship with Mrs. Brodier. I could have engineered the capability, but I didn't. I am deeply in love with her, and she loves, or loved, me in a much less intense but still very real way. Miss Benning nodded. I have no doubt of your essential humanity, Mr. Johansson. I dealt with you over the transfer of title for the business. Remember? Your emotional turmoil was obvious and very real. We walked in silence for a few moments before she continued. While it will be an uphill battle for the plaintiffs, it's not a slam dunk by any means for us. But Mrs. Brodier expected pushback from her children and made some arrangements in advance, including setting up a defense fund that the children wouldn't be able to block. I nodded silently. Bridget had always been a careful, methodical thinker. Went with the career choice, I guess. She'd have covered all the bases. None of which made things any easier. I had Bridget's permission to replicate her, but I would have to wait for the wheels of justice to slowly grind their way to a conclusion. 24. Explorations. Herschel, April 22-27, Kuiper Belt, Delta Pavonis. Ants must feel like this. The other's carrier, which we'd named Hulk 1, was massive. A 10-kilometer long cylinder, 1 kilometer in diameter. It dwarfed even our version 5 Heaven hulks. At the moment, I was slowly drifting down the central access shaft while roamers painted numbers on each cargo door. I wasn't just being anal. We discovered that we needed to refer to specific locations by something more helpful than grunting and pointing. SAR scans had revealed a lot of details about the ship and its contents, but sooner or later, we would have to try powering it up. Those massive cargo segment doors wouldn't be opening manually, never mind the 100-meter diameter hatches at each end. How's it going, Herschel? Fine, I replied. Almost done. 864 cargo bays. That number mean anything to you? There was a moment of silence before Neil replied. It's 600, base 12. And come to think of it, the other's image that Bill retrieved had 6 feeding fingers on each side of its maw. I grinned. Coincidence? I think not. Nope, there's another universal, I think. Your number base will depend on your number of digits. The PAV were base 10. Are base 10, Neil. They're not all gone. There was a sigh. Yeah. Well, there was a mood killer. Anyway, I said, perhaps too brightly, as soon as I'm done here, we can get on to the job of figuring out the power system. I'm anxious to see what some of the stuff in those bays actually is. As long as we don't activate some of the stuff in the process. Yeah, I hear you. Maybe we'll have a nuke in place just in case we need to terminate with prejudice. I have a concern about that, Herschel. I'd rather avoid any action that results in destroying Hulk 1. Well, hold on. I took a moment to load my roamers and the attendant drones and admire the last numbered bay. 864. I don't see how we can do this without some risk, buddy. How about we cut into one of the bays? Well, that was certainly an option. The bay partitions were stupid thick, but we weren't on a schedule. Okay, let's do that. We cut into bay number 1, simply because SAR scans showed a lot of unidentifiable stuff in it. The roamers had to cut trenches in the wall and keep widening them, but eventually they were able to pull a plug of metal away from the surrounding wall. We left it floating in the central corridor and sent in a half-dozen roamers. It looked like this carrier hadn't disgorged all its fighting units before we'd taken it out. The bay contained several dozen drones, each slightly bigger than a Heaven 1 vessel. They were in cradles with umbilicals connecting them to the ship, probably control and power feeds. Of course, there was no power, and we'd taken out the ship AI, so no control. Neil poked a finger at a close-up image of an umbilical connection. If we unhook that, do you think the drone will come to life? Don't know, Neil. I rubbed my forehead. A delaying tactic, and we both knew it. Ultimately, do we really have an alternative? Neil stared at the video window for a full 2 seconds before turning to me. Okay, how about this? Take one apart, piece by piece. Analyze as we go. Eventually, we should be able to figure out what their readiness state is. That is the least bad idea I've ever heard. I grinned back at him. Let's do it. It took more than a week to strip the drone down, piece by piece. In the end, we were forced to conclude that activation was probably done from the carrier AI's end, not at the drone's end. In any case, the one we'd disassembled had been inert, no power, and no way to power up without power. Just the same, paranoia was the watchword. We picked a random drone and placed roamers inside it, ready to begin breaking things if the drone got uppity. Ready? I said to Neil. Ready, he replied. Neil was in charge of destruction, and I was in charge of unplugging. Without giving myself any more opportunity for second guessing, I instructed the roamer to eject the umbilical from the drone. We waited. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. Enough of this, Neil grumbled. It's scanning time. Matching actions to words, he instructed one of our drones to give the subject a good once-over. The scan came up in my holotank within milliseconds. Nothing. Inert. I looked at Neil. Satisfied? Me? Since when am I the bad guy? Since always. I'm always reassuring you. Oh, bite me. You are so full of it. Neil shook his head in sorrow. So next question, do we cut into every cargo bay with something in it and start unhooking stuff? It'll take years. What's our alternative? I'm starting to like the nuke idea. Neil gave me a crooked grin. Okay, I replied. We're going to have to trace all the wiring to find out if we can leave the bays unpowered if we start up the reactor. And, sorry to say, we're also going to have to place a nuke in here in case we wake something up that we shouldn't have. Let's just hope it doesn't come to that. Neil sighed. This is beginning to sound too much like real work. Real work described it very well. Some of the others' design decisions were, well, suboptimal, at least as far as we could tell. In several cases, power conduits split, went around a large patch of nothing in particular, then reconnected on the far side. We scanned the section of nothing twice, but found, nothing. Well, look, Neil mused. Sometimes when you're designing something, you make allowances for future expansion. As long as you have a good idea what the requirements will be, you can allow for it. So it's an expansion slot. Yeah, thanks, Captain Sarcasm. Still, you're probably not far wrong. That's wonderful, Neil. But are we any closer to being able to activate this flying island nation? Let's have a look, Hirsch. With that, Neil pulled up our working schematic. He quickly updated it with this latest information, then directed the simulation to power up. We watched the simulation as telltales indicated virtual sections that were receiving power. Eventually, the simulation ended with the Hulk in a stable state, and no issues that we could see. Neil and I looked at each other, smiled, and said in unison, "We're good to go." 25. Battle. Bill, June 22-23, 82 Aridany. Premier Campbell put her face in her hands and was silent for several seconds. President Ito attempted to remain stoic, but I could see that he was shaken. Campbell looked up. Mac? He's gone? No, ma'am, I replied. We have his matrix. Or at least it's still in one piece and we know where it is, but he's offline for the moment. We're trying to get it to a colony site for safekeeping. Campbell nodded, looking relieved. And how can we help, Mr. Johansson? I turned to President Ito's video image. We're trying to inventory all our assets in this system. Anything that can be used as a weapon, anything that can be remote controlled, anything SCUT enabled, anything that can get out of atmosphere.
How do the androids work? I believe there's one at each colony site.
At Brighton, those are SCUT controlled, so yes, we can use those. That's one more, well, 2 more control loci for us. As soon as we can, we'll send a couple of drones to pick them up. We can use them to relay orders to the non-SCUT mining drones. I thought for a moment. Plus, they'll be useful to supplement the roamers for manipulation. Ito nodded, and silence descended. Campbell finally broke the pause.
We are at war, essentially, right? Are the colonies in danger?
I considered for a millisecond. I don't see how. At least on an immediate basis, ma'am. Medeiros doesn't have anything that can bomb you from orbit. If we can keep the auto factories from him, or at least keep the printers away, that won't change. If he gets a printer, or already has one, he still has to bootstrap up through all the automation needed for an auto factory before he can start building something like an asteroid mover. And there's no way he'll be dumb enough to try to print anything explosive. On the other hand, Ito said in a slow drawl, inviting me to explain counterpoint. I grinned. On the other hand, we have no printer capability at the moment. Although we are in possession of the actual printers, more or less. And we'd have to go through the same bootstrapping process. To a lesser extent, maybe because we have roamers and drones, and now the 2 androids.
So it's détente.
I'm not sure it's even at that level, ma'am. Right now, it's more like that Hugh Grant and Colin Firth fight scene in Bridget Jones's Diary. She looked at me askance, then shook her head without asking. Apparently, Mac already had a reputation. Look, I continued. If we can get one or more of the printers onto one of your worlds and get enough raw elements down for it, and do all this without being intercepted by Medeiros, then we can maybe build busters or something.
That's a lot of ifs,
Campbell replied. Well, it'll depend on what Medeiros does next. I'm afraid we're forced to react to his moves. Any attempt on our part to control the play will result in a missile down our throats.
How many missiles does he have?
0, we thought, so unknown. Ito thought for a moment.
You have a number of mining drones, I understand. Can you use them to ram the Brazilian?
It was a good try, and I nodded an acknowledgement. Sorry, President Ito, but that would be like trying to ram a sports car with tractors. In principle, you could do damage, but first you have to catch him. Ito sighed and sat back. Again, there was a contemplative silence. Look, I said, if you think of anything, call, email, or text me. We'll keep working on it from our end, and I'll keep you updated.
Good enough.
Premier Campbell nodded and ended her connection. A moment later, Ito blinked out as well. I sighed, sat back, and looked at the ceiling, like the others weren't bad enough. By the time Medeiros got to the nearest LaGrange Auto Factory location, we'd long since flung the printers and print heads well beyond his ability to detect them. The Bobs had also managed to hide, damage, or collect most of the Auto Factory automation, leaving nothing valuable except the actual metal ingots. We watched Medeiros from a non-SCUT drone, carefully disguised as Flotsam, running on power cells so as not to show up on radiation detectors. It would run down soon, but if Medeiros didn't pick up on it, we could collect it later. If he did, he would have gained only a regular mining drone, and one without a fusion reactor. The Brazilian craft buzzed around, inspecting and searching, then settled on a single location and stopped moving. I half expected some kind of raging and destroying things, but realistically, Medeiros was career military and presumably well-disciplined. He wouldn't waste missiles on petulance. I hoped he would decide on a strategy before the drone gave out. We'd identified 3 possibilities. 1, head for one of the colonies and set up a picket, on the presumption that we had sent at least one printer that way. 2, head off and start scanning for printers and print heads on their lonely trajectories. Or 3, Start looking for roamers and mining drones to either destroy or try to take over. And finally, just when the drone was on its last few watts of stored power, Medeiros accelerated out of the area. Do we have an indication of where he's going? I jerked in surprise. Too intent on watching Medeiros, I hadn't realized that Will was visiting my VR. I turned to him. I don't think so. He's just headed off in what appears to be some random direction. The power cells are about to give out, so we can't track him by SUDAR. Will muttered an expletive, a clear indication that the situation was getting to him. We have to assume scenarios 1 or 2 then, since they're the worst cases. How many printers and heads have we rerouted to a colony? 2 of each going to each colony, well spread out. Of course, he can spot them on approach with a SUDAR sweep, but he'll have to be close enough to physically intercept. Then he'll have to intercept without destroying them. Destruction is acceptable from our point of view. I nodded. This is going to be a long, drawn-out battle, Will. Garfield and I were sitting, drinking coffee, taking one of our increasingly rare breaks, when Guppy popped in.
Printer convoy en route to Asgard has been hit with a SUDAR sweep.
Garfield and I looked at each other. Crap, he said. That means he went for option 1. I guess it makes sense, I replied. For option 2, he'd be scanning an increasingly large volume of space. This way, we are essentially coming to him. I turned to Guppy. Were you able to triangulate?
Negative. Sweep was short range.
Smart, Garfield said. He doesn't announce himself unless he makes contact, and if he does, he's right on top of us. Which means he's right on top of us. I smacked my forehead. Doesn't matter. Anyway, I checked, and this particular group has no SCUT. They'll have to operate on standing orders.
Convoy has been disabled. Video feed cut off.
Garfield and I exchanged a look. Had Medeiros simply blown up the convoy? Was his plan to deny us the printers? Wordlessly, I called up the truncated video. Garfield watched the 3-second sequence. Well, hell, I said when we were done. It appears Medeiros can learn. He's building busters. Or he built busters. Wait, when did he build busters? Garfield frowned and continued. If this is the Alpha Centauri Medeiros, then his first exposure to us was the day we raised their installation. He would have had to build busters after that. There was no indication that the Brazilians were building kinetic weapons before that point. I gave him a sickly grin. Sorry, buddy, I guess you missed the conversation after the attack. We figure he has at least one printer of his own. So he learned from Alpha Centauri. So why is he doing what he's doing? Two-pronged strategy. Attempt to gather as many printers as he can while denying them to us. Geometric progression means a small advantage up front can turn into an insurmountable lead, eventually. I stared into space for a few milliseconds. We have to take him out, now. If he gets ahead of us, the colonists are as good as dead. Garfield closed his eyes and shook his head slowly. And we put them there. Captain Richards from the Asgard colony pressed his lips together and said nothing. He didn't have to. On top of everything the colonists were dealing with, they now had Medeiros to worry about. Are you certain that he will attack the colony? Not certain, Captain, but he's made it pretty clear on previous encounters that he is utterly loyal to Brazil, considers us to be at war, and isn't interested in discussions. I'm also not entirely sure he's sane at this point. I looked over at Garfield, who rolled his eyes dramatically. I'd hate to try communicating with him, only to find that we'd attracted his attention to the colonies. Richards nodded and sat back with a huff. And we have nothing. Not that we've been able to find. We could ask Mac if we could get him onto a cradle, but right now we can't risk trying to fly his Matrix in. We're getting occasional glimpses of Medeiros, and he does his best to destroy anything he detects. At both colonies? How many of him are there? Richards frowned at me. I thought for a second. There's no overlap in appearances, so there's only one of him, but I think he's programmed his busters to patrol and knock down anything they detect. Right now, he owns the high ground. General Kiroshi from the Japanese colony had been listening without comment in another video window. Now he spoke up.
We have only small printers, useful for quick manufacturing of minor items, but insufficient for anything like your busters. And it would take months to bootstrap up to real industrial printers.
Richards nodded. Same here. Ours are big enough to print more mosquito killers, but that's... Wait, what? I sat up straight. Richards raised an eyebrow. Super vampire something something mosquitoes. Mac didn't mention them? Yes, I remember them. I gave him a sideways glare. I didn't realize you were handling manufacturing yourselves. Well, sure, because we needed thousands and Mac couldn't be bothered. They're about the size of a baseball, so not really useful for anything but mosquito patrol. But thousands? I leaned forward, radiating interest. Richards' eyes started to grow rounder as he realized something was up. Yes, most of them are on standby right now, since we seem to have beaten back the Scourge. We were going to return them to raw materials eventually, but I think we had 3,000 or 4,000 running around at one point. I let a slow smile grow on my face. They may be small, but a few hundred hitting a buster at the same time will still have an effect. We may be able to clear the sky around Asgard long enough to get the printers to ground. Can they even fly outside of atmosphere? Not a problem, Captain. It's actually more trouble building them to fly in atmosphere. Excellent, the captain said. Let's get this operation going. The mosquito killers were too small to carry Scud comms, so we had to give the AMIs complete enough instructions to handle any situation we could think of. 1 in each 100 was designated as an observer, ordered to send a video record back to the colony, if possible, or to record and return otherwise. We sent off 2,000 killers in 5 squads, hoping to catch as many busters as possible by surprise. A couple of killers were programmed to leak radio telemetry, which hopefully would attract some of Medeiros' devices. Captain Richards was mirroring everything to Kiroshi and myself. I watched the numerous video windows as the observers delivered status and telemetry. Got a blip, Captain Richards announced. I'd seen the change in the video window several milliseconds before, of course, but there was no good reason to remind him of my true nature. The telemetry from the observer indicated 2 bogies approaching the group. Per their orders, the killers changed course to intercept. We hoped that Medeiros hadn't programmed caution into his busters. A bunch of baseball-sized objects hopefully wouldn't trigger the default danger avoidance routine. The busters zeroed in on the noisy killers, seemingly ignoring the cloud of attendants. At the last possible moment, every single mosquito killer altered course to aim directly at the 2 busters. The change apparently registered with the dim AMI brains because both busters went into hard turns. Too little, too late, though. The smaller and more maneuverable killers easily kept up with the change in vectors. Contact wasn't the dramatic flash we were used to seeing as 2 heavy devices collided at interplanetary speeds. The killers avoided the large steel ball up front and went for reactor cooling radiators, surge emitters, and other obvious signs of technology. It was like being pelted in a hailstorm. The first couple dozen impacts had no real effect, then dents started to appear, followed by seams popping, then parts flying off. In less than 30 seconds, the busters were drifting aimlessly, and we still had more than 100 killers left. See if you can get them to shepherd the parts into low orbit, Richard suggested. If we can rescue the material, great. Otherwise, we push it into atmosphere and deny it to Medeiros. I nodded. A good strategy. I wasn't sure how we'd get that much mass down to ground level, other than the obvious way, but I'd worry about that once we'd rescued some drones. 2 down, Richards grinned at me, then turned in his video window to face Kiroshi. General, once we've cleared the Asgard environs, I'll send a squad of mosquito killers your way. General Kiroshi nodded. Thank you. Even if we are not ultimately successful, the process of attrition should keep Medeiros busy. Yes, I added. We just need to knock off busters faster than he can make them. And if he's making busters, he's not making more printers. We'll keep at this, Bill. Captain Richards nodded to me. I'll keep you up to date. Good enough. I still had a war with the others to prepare for. 26. Cities in fight. Marcus, September 2215, Poseidon. I watched the long-range image which showed the expanding cloud of debris that used to be my Heaven vessel decoy. I'd been lying about my location for several months now, and the Council seemed to have bought it. 3 Council security vessels left the area at far too high an acceleration for the cargo vessels they appeared to be. It would seem the Council could be sneaky as well. I fired off a report to Riker, CC'd to Bill, and saved a backup to my Fortress of Solitude, circling Eta Cassiopeia B. If the Council ever found that, I'd be thoroughly hooped. Fortunately, that was unlikely. The Council still had fewer than a dozen ships, and the companion star simply hadn't come up in discussions for a long time. Of course, the Council had obviously been engaging in covert preparations as well, as evinced by the 3 souped-up and armed cargo ships. Now that they believed me dead, I hoped that they would openly play their hand. I returned my presence to my android, which was standing at parade rest. As I moved my arms into a more relaxed position, everyone turned to me.
Well,
Cal said. I grinned at him. 3 very non-standard cargo vessels just took out my decoy vessel. It would have attempted evasive tactics consistent with its published specs. I'm sure the security personnel are very proud of themselves.
what about the cargo vessels?
I've got some stealth busters following them right now, but we don't know what the Council's total strength is or where they've placed it. I have to assume that my estimate of a dozen ships is incorrect. We'll have to take a wait-and-see stance until they show their hand. And remember, officially, I'm dead. Gina looked up from her phone and cut into the conversation.
They've moved on 4 cities: Lothar, Morbus, Xanator, and Gethal. Attempted to board and take over. You were right. They were trying to avoid damaging the cities.
Status? I asked.
Repelled with significant losses. They didn't expect resistance. They also didn't expect,
Gina replied.
weapons systems that weren't on the blueprints.
I grinned. My fault. I forgot to file the changes with the permits department. Cal waved his phone.
They've made an announcement.
We all turned to him, eager to hear what the Council had come up with. Cal read through the text, deliberately injecting a pompous tone into the pronouncement. When he was done, we all sat in a semicircle, ready for a council of war. So the takeaway, I said, looking up at the dome overhead, is that the evil replicant is defunct and everyone should be good little citizens and come back to the mats. Or else.
And if we don't, they'll start shooting down cities in 24 hours.
Cal shook his head in exaggerated disbelief.
We're at war now, even if the word hasn't actually been used. Blowing Marcus up can't really be misinterpreted.
I suppose they could take the stance that I'm not alive, therefore it was just a case of obsoleting some recalcitrant equipment. I gave my friends a lopsided grin. And the thing with those cities could be called a police action. Gina rolled her eyes at me, mocking my favorite expression.
Or they were just tired of listening to you talk. Now are you willing to start fighting?
I shook my head. I still don't know where all their assets are. I want to take everything out cleanly in one strike. And I don't want to have to kill anyone.
Good luck with that.
Cal muttered. We spent the next few hours monitoring developments. Things seemed to have settled into a stalemate, with the Council making threats and the cities daring them to try or simply remaining silent. Then, more trouble. 2 ships came out of Sunward and launched missiles at Amhor. My assets were all space-side, shadowing or searching for Council assets, so I had nothing for defense. The city, though, had those undocumented features. Particle weapon turrets, courtesy of Bill's Skunk Works, activated immediately and attempted to shoot the missiles out of the sky. The attackers responded by firing more missiles. I'm impressed, I said. The basic cargo ship design doesn't have a lot of room for weapons storage and launchers. I'd be interested in seeing how...
Christ's sake, Marcus, we're in danger here. Could you dial it back?
I gave Cal a rueful smile by way of apology, then turned back to watch the drama. The ships seemed to have emptied themselves of missiles, and our defensive batteries had taken out the first 2 missiles. The second pair were getting too close for comfort, though, and seemed to have figured out the defensive patterns as they were evading all attempts to shoot them out of the sky. With a flash of inspiration, I took control of a couple of flyers sitting in the docking bay. I sent them toward the missiles at full acceleration. Flyers were not military vehicles or flying explosives, so they really had no chance of catching or even intercepting an approaching missile. But they did have the effect of splitting the attention of the missile AMIs. It was just enough to slow down the dodging, and the defensive turrets blew both missiles out of the air. The ships, now apparently unarmed, turned and flew off. I called a couple of drones from orbit to shadow them. If they flew back to a base somewhere to reload, I'd have a target. But there was no time to celebrate our victory. Cal leaped to his feet and uttered a string of profanities. Then he turned to look at the rest of us and said, "The bastard shot down Thark." There were gasps and cries of shock, but not surprise. Thark and Amhor were the residences of what we somewhat ironically called the Revolutionary Council. We'd published disinformation, but somehow the Council had seen through it. Regardless, the Council had just upped the ante. Gina asked,
Survivors?
Cal looked at his phone for several seconds, his eyes moving back and forth. I noticed that several other people were poking their tablets furiously.
Their escape pods were observed ejecting before it hit water, but I'd bet not everyone got out.
Gina glared at me.
Now we're at war. They're trying to hit us everywhere at once, to end it before we can react. It's not going to stop until they think they've won. It will just continue to escalate, and more people will die. Now, Marcus.
I sighed and nodded my head. Without a word, I deactivated my Android and returned to VR. A quick status check at computer speeds showed that I had busters trailing all Council ships that we'd been able to locate. I ordered all busters to attack, concentrating on taking out the reactor or drive systems. The subject of cloaking technology hadn't really come up in conversation with the Council, so the ships were caught flat-footed. All clean shots. There should be no deaths unless someone was standing right by the reactor at the wrong time. Escape pods ejected from all of them, none of which would help with the Council. For that, I activated Phase 2. The Council had set up security at strategic locations such as power stations and flyer depots, as well as roving patrols to ensure citizens stayed put and obeyed curfews. I gave the command and cargo drones dropped off squads of roamers throughout the northern and southern maps. I'd learned the utility of roamers as foot soldiers almost 100 years ago in New Handletown. This time, I had more than just the 20-centimeter models available. All over the towns and industrial sections, Council security forces found themselves set upon by roamers. From the 1-inch models that would try to crawl down your pants, right up to the 2-meter heavy lifting models. Every single one armed with plasma cutters, pliers, and a total lack of fear. Within 10 minutes, I got the all clear from Gina, who was coordinating with local resistance. I pulled up a video window. "Have you located the Council members yet?" Gina shook her head.
No. As we expected, their published locations were all bogus. Chances are the movement history is at least partly fiction as well. We're analyzing on the basis of defensibility and obscurity.
I nodded. My money is still on subs. Gina snorted.
If so, they can stay out there all they want. I'm not going to risk an encounter with a Kraken or Hydra just to capture those turds.
Maybe the wildlife will take care of it for us. Cal popped up in another call window, joining the conference.
We've got control of the comms center. Want me to send out on all points?
Do it, I nodded. And see if you can get an update on Thark.
Already done. We've pulled about half the population out of the drink.
Cal responded.
Still scanning for more pods.
At the moment, there are about 150 people missing. I closed my eyes, feeling nauseated. We'd admitted the possibility of casualties, but the reality, even a potential reality at the moment, was so much harder to take. Okay, Cal, keep me updated. When I had time, I would have to do some soul searching. Between the Poseidon Revolution, the Sol System War, and the overthrow of New Jerusalem, My various incarnations seem to always be in the thick of things. How many deaths was I answerable for? 27. Repairs. Herschel, July 22-27, Delta Pavonis. There's no real reason for your virtual reality self to be tense. I knew that. It didn't help. I found myself gritting my teeth so hard that my jaw began to ache. After months of investigation and tinkering, Neil and I were ready to try activating the power core. We had the nuclear deterrent sitting in the middle of the central corridor, just in case. But truthfully, neither of us really thought it would be necessary. The wiring had eventually succumbed to our detective work, and we were confident that we would be able to power up the core without powering up the bays. Which still left the question of activating the power core. Since we'd never seen this particular technology before, there was a lot of guesswork involved. Needless to say, guesswork and power cores did not go well together. We weren't total idiots. We were standing off more than 1,000 clicks while the roamers and drones ran through the final steps. I idly wondered for a moment if the AMIs ever got tired of wearing the red shirts. Probably not, or they'd have gone on strike by now. If this doesn't work, we're going to be in deep doo-doo. Neil glanced sideways at me. Better than being a cloud of ionized gas. And even if it does work, there are going to be questions, Neil. We really should have announced the find on the first day. Neil glared at me, one side of his mouth up in a sneer of disbelief. I hate you. I grinned at him. Okay, joking aside, buddy. We're 8th generation Bobs. Pond scum. Star Trek security looks down their noses at us. I'd like to have something under my belt that I can stamp on my hull. Neil took a deep breath, let it out slowly. Yeah, if everything goes well, all will be forgiven. So... Scanning started, Neil responded, taking the hint. You have an image. Okay, Herschel. Anytime. I gave the order, and the roamers started the activation procedure in Hulk 1. It took almost 3 minutes for the alien equipment to go through whatever startup sequence it needed. We could review the whole thing later via the recorded SUDAR video. And finally, pay dirt. Lights came on in the alien craft. Readings indicated rising power levels in engineering subsystems. We'd been careful to ensure that most of the vessel remained unpowered. We certainly didn't want to activate a security system somewhere. The roamers ran a few output tests and reported the results. I whistled. That's just a stupid level of power generation, assuming it's linear. Remember that scene in Forbidden Planet with the power meters? Neil grinned at me. This is just like that. We're barely tilting the first meter. I nodded, eyes unfocused. I think it might be time to pay Bill a visit. Well, there are no laws in the Bobiverse, of course. Bill's expression belied the casualness of his tone. Neil and I looked at each other nervously. But you guys are still morons. Bill raised his hands in an I give up gesture. If something had gone wrong and taken you out, we'd never have known about it. We've been doing backups, Bill. And how would we know to activate your backup? ESP? Oh, yeah, there's that. I looked down at my shoes. Bill relented a little, seeing my expression. Actually, Herschel, that's another project I'm working on. The Battle of Delta Pavonis made it clear that we need a more organized backup system. He waved us toward chairs and called in Jeeves. It looked like we wouldn't be flayed after all. Okay, fill me in. I sat down and accepted a coffee. I took a moment for a sip, to give me time to calm my nerves. Then I called up the diagrams and schematics as well as video records. You already know the basics. We found the hulks, got the power system working in one of them. The power core is not fusion-based. I'd almost swear it uses some variation on the Casimir effect. There's a separate analysis on that. I pushed one set of schematics aside to bring up a larger scale diagram. Hulk 2 is scrap. We've been through it from one end to the other, and there's nothing interesting. It's basically a big old pile of salvage. We've had our devices breaking it down into transportable chunks for a couple of months now. But here's the thing. I paused for effect. Hulk One is a big, sort of hollow container with built-in power. The AI and drive systems are gone, of course, but so what? I grinned at Bill. Bill frowned, and I realized he hadn't gotten it yet. I looked at Neil, suddenly uncertain. Had we missed something obvious? Were we about to paint ourselves as total twits? Neil rolled his eyes, just the tiniest amount, then turned to Bill. Put a set of mover plates around it, Bill, and it's the biggest damn colony ship ever made. It just needs stasis pods. Bill's eyes slowly grew wide as the penny dropped. Holy... I grinned, confidence returning. And you could move the entire remaining Earth population in one trip. 28. Payback. Bob, April 22-24, Eden. Caerleon was a busy area, almost frantic. Maybe it was the age of the residents and the relative lack of family groups. Caerleon had been colonized by juveniles just into puberty and going through the adolescent rebellion stage. Marvin and I agreed that we'd created a baby boomer generation when we moved everyone to Camelot and the birth rate subsequently surged. All those teenagers, getting hormonal at the same time, had probably just egged each other on. At any rate, it made sneaking up a difficult operation. I had the advantages of lack of scent and ability to stay completely still, of course. Plus some commando camouflage tricks that I looked up in the ship libraries. Still, it took almost 5 hours to maneuver into position. Original Bob would have been a single giant muscle cramp by that point, but android muscles didn't get tired. And I was now in position. Surveillance had shown that Fred had a preferred location for his bodily functions, and he was very much a creature of habit. I picked a spot where I could take him on the way back and settled down to wait. As Fred turned back to the trail, I slammed into him, shoving him up against a tree. I placed the edge of my flint knife against his throat. Hello, Fred. Remember our last conversation? Fred's eyes were wide with fear, and he made no attempt to struggle. I own you right now, Cootsie. Practically spit his favorite insult back in his face. Whether you live to see the sun set today depends on my mood. Understand? Fred understood. The odor of fear emanated from him, but he apparently wasn't going to just fold.
My friends won't let this go.
He said.
They'll come after you.
And he was right. This was something I'd worried about, but had hoped I wouldn't have to deal with. If he didn't capitulate in some manner, I might actually end up having to kill him. Could I do that in cold blood? If he just dug in his heels and called my bluff, I'd have to either follow through or lose any credibility. On the other hand, if I'd come with Donald, Fred would already be dead. It was so tempting. But even after being embedded in Deltan civilization for all these years, I still had a 21st century human squeamishness about taking life. What's your problem, Fred? Can't hunt on your own? Can't figure out which end of the spear to use? Or are you just lazy? Fred's ears went flat and his lips curled back from his teeth in a reaction that for a Deltan was an expression of rage.
It's so easy for you, isn't it? Sit there with all the resources and yap about how everyone else isn't living up to your standards. I'm not answerable to you.
Well, right now, you kind of are. I pushed the blade harder against his throat to make the point. But Fred was angry now. His reaction, his unexpected rage, surprised me. I'd mishandled this somehow, and now there was no way he was going to back down. Interesting food for thought, but right now it left me between a rock and a hard place. With a flash of inspiration, I directed a spy drone to make some suspicious noises in order to draw over some of the locals. Within moments, Fred and I could both hear his friends approaching and calling for him. He grinned at me in triumph. If his friends found a corpse, the whole village would be after me. That was fine. Let him think that. I put my face up close to his. Just remember that I can find you whenever I want. Next time, I won't discuss it. I won't even let you know I'm there. Maybe you should start hanging around with your friends all the time. With that, I gave him the usual quick jab in the breadbasket and grabbed his spear as he folded. I vanished into the forest just before his friends came into sight. Well, that hadn't gone quite according to plan. I made my way back to Camelot, still trying to convince myself that I could kill him if I had to. I told Archimedes the story over dinner. He took Fred's spear and examined it while I talked.
Donald would have just killed him,
He said,
me, not so much. It's hard to kill people unless they're attacking you.
Archimedes maneuvered the spear around until he was looking at the tip.
This is really terrible work. Someone just shattered a nodule and tied the sharpest shard onto the shaft.
He shook his head.
It's as likely to fall off as penetrate the target. If this is what they have, I'm not surprised they're having to steal food from our hunters.
I raised my eyebrows. Okay, the android actually pointed its ears forward and down, but it felt to me like the equivalent human expression. If the Caerleon citizens were having less hunting success because of equipment failure, could it be that easy? Perceived inequities like that had started more than one war on Earth. I liked to think Deltans were a little more sensible than humans in general, but not by that much. I sat back against the boulder behind me and stared into space, considering the options. 29. Looming Storm. Howard, May 2220, Vulcan. I stood outside the courtroom, taking deep breaths. I had an almost uncontrollable urge to drop a rock on the building. I'd expected nastiness. Ms. Benning had warned me that the children's strategy would be based on attacks. Knowing it and being subjected to it were two different things, though. To listen to their lawyer, I was some weird cross between Rasputin, Svengali, Machiavelli, and Lucifer. They hadn't quite accused me of drugging and brainwashing Bridget, but they'd sure been trying to imply it. Ms. Benning came to stand beside me.
There will be more of the same after recess. Just remember that he's trying to get a rise out of you. To get you to make a mistake.
I smiled slightly. I have some advantages in that area. Indeed, during cross-exam, I had enabled the endocrine control system. Funny that the cloning process, even with all the different generations of Heaven vessels, still included that subsystem. With the control on, I was only mildly concerned about Mr. Kistler's accusations and innuendo. And a good thing, right now I would happily reach over and crush his throat with one hand. Dr. Onagi came over to stand with us. I looked at him. Is it appropriate for us to speak? He looked at Ms. Benning, who smiled in response.
Not a problem. The hospital is named in their suit as well, so we're on the same side. What's on your mind, Dr. Onagi?
I don't trust them. This is news? I raised an eyebrow at him.
No, I mean, beyond the obvious adversarial situation. In particular, the eldest daughter just seems like a real piece of work. I wonder if they lose the case, if she'll take it gracefully.
Ms. Benning's eyebrows rose.
You mean, as in sabotage of some kind?
Dr. Onagi nodded. Oh, wow. I couldn't actually feel the blood drain from my face. Blood, after all. But the elevator-dropping feeling was definitely there. We could win and still lose.
This bears some careful thought,
Ms. Benning said.
Being found in contempt of a court order could prejudice your case. So don't do anything precipitous. Just the same.
We settled into an uncomfortable silence as we each stared into space. 30. Armageddon. Bill, June 22, 23, 82 Iridini. I was going over some plans with Garfield when I received an emergency call from Captain Richards. I popped up the video window. What's up, Captain? Bill, We were doing so well with clearing the busters from orbit that I decided I could spare a dozen or so killers to reconnoiter the Lagrange points. To see what Medeiros is up to, you understand? I nodded, not liking the implication. Richards popped up a grainy, long-distance image. We picked this up. The frame rate and resolution were low, but I could make out that Medeiros was working around the metal ingots used as raw materials for the auto factories. What's he doing? I asked. We ran some image interpolations. It looks like he's attaching busters to an ingot with cables. Oh, hell. A poor man's asteroid mover. The ingots weren't huge, but they were metal and would survive re-entry almost unscathed. One of those could certainly create a new Barringer crater, more than enough to wipe out a colony anyway. This advances our schedule. How are you doing with the printers? We've got a half dozen. Richards grimaced. One is working on a cradle for Mac, 3 are working on drones and roamers, and 2 are producing small busters per your plans. He shook his head. What's with 20-kilogram busters, anyway? I gave him a weak smile. Something Bob has been using as anti-personnel weapons, but our experience with the mosquito killers shows that more small attackers can be as effective as a few large attackers, and more flexible. Medeiros will probably be putting more armor on his busters by now, so the killers are going to be less effective. So, these will up the ante. So, do we switch to nothing but busters? Not just yet, Captain. We can do without Mac for now, but we need drones and roamers, for assembly if nothing else. I'll run a min-max analysis to figure out what mix of construction will get us the best return. I'll let you know. We nodded and disconnected at the same time. I turned to Garfield, who had been listening to the whole exchange. He's planning on just smashing things, isn't he? Garfield looked gray with worry. It seems to be a theme with the Brazilian probes, Gar. I don't know if that's a cultural thing or military conditioning or something that Brazilian scientists installed as imperatives when they were building the replicants. Or they're all insane. I shrugged. Doesn't matter in the end. We have to react to the threat, and I don't see any reason to change the no-quarter policy on Medeiros. Garfield's only reply was a snort of agreement. He started moving the ingot. Richards glared at me out of the video window. How did he manage that? I asked. He was nowhere near having enough busters just yesterday. Richards shrugged. He still doesn't really. I think he's starting before he's really ready. The acceleration is vanishingly small. But he can add more in flight as he makes them. Richards nodded. Unfortunately, it's too soon to tell which colony he's aiming for. He may not even have decided yet. It'll be another 24 hours before he has to commit. We have printers on both colonies now, right? I started to run my hand through my hair, then caught myself. So there's no advantage to him one way or the other. My money's on Asgard, simply because he can get it there sooner. We have to move on him now. Richards set his jaw. I'll contact General Kiroshi, see what he can put in the air. Do that, Captain. Call me back. It's not enough, Kiroshi said. We are 2 busters short of a one-on-one matchup, and that's without dealing with Medeiros himself. We can't win this. And that's assuming we have eyes on all his devices. If he's carrying a couple in his hold, it will put us even farther behind. I don't see it, I replied, looking at Richards. If he had more, they'd be pulling the ingot as well. Do we have a choice? I sighed. Not really, Captain. The longer we wait, the harder it will be to redirect the ingot. And by the time it actually gets here, we'll have built 2 more busters at the most. There were a few more comments, but we all knew we really had no choice. These busters would have to be pre-programmed, as we couldn't afford the time to add Scud comms. We sent them out from both colonies, timed to arrive simultaneously. I was about to disconnect when I had a thought. Gentlemen, how many mosquito killers do we have left? And where are they? Kiroshi answered. A little over 200. They're all in orbit around Takama. We haven't had any close-in encounters at either colony for a few days. Why? Let's throw them into the mix. I'll do some calculations and give you the times and vectors. Our busters arrived at the expected time and place. Because they were operating without scuds, we were getting the video play-by-play several minutes after the fact. Whatever was going to happen had already happened. There could be no finesse on this operation. Each one of our busters would take out one of Medeiros' busters. We would aim several busters at Medeiros himself, but he would use his busters to intercept. Barring a miracle in him missing one, we'd be left with Medeiros and 2 busters to deal with. We watched as 14 video images closed in on 14 targets, then 14 video images disappeared. Well, that was textbook, Richards said. I smiled tightly. And right about now, Medeiros should be feeling pretty smug. 2 new video windows popped up as the incoming mosquito killers zeroed in on Medeiros. We knew we would leave 2 of Medeiros' busters, but we made sure those busters were tethered to the ingot and unavailable for defense. Medeiros detected the incoming killers and turned tail, but he was far too late. Unlike the busters, which had decelerated to arrive at the battleground at a controllable velocity, the killers had continued to accelerate all the way from Takama. They arrived with a considerable momentum. Fewer than half struck the Brazilian ship, but 100 small impacts were still sufficient to open up the side of his vessel. Medeiros lost his line and began to drift. "He's down," Richards said. "Not sure if he's dead, but propulsion is offline." "Do we have any more busters? Any more killers?" Hiroshi looked from one to the other of us. I shook my head. Busters are all expended. There are lots of killers, but they're traveling away from Medeiros at high speed. They'll take as long to decelerate as they took to accelerate to that velocity. Then they have to accelerate back. "He might still be out by the time they get back. We don't know how many roamers he has left after the space battle over Mac." That was true. It was certainly worth a shot anyway. "Okay, General, I'm sending orders to the killers now. Light speed delay will add to the total turnaround time. I think we're looking at 22 hours before they get back." Richards frowned. "Hell, we could get a couple of drones there in less time than that." "To do what? Even at full acceleration, they're unlikely to do much damage." I was thinking more along the lines of grabbing Medeiros himself. I stared at Richards. That hadn't occurred to me. Stick some roamers in the drone's holds, and they could enter the Brazilian ship and extract the replicant matrix. I felt a twinge of nausea at what we were not quite planning. Memories of Homer, of the 5 cubes back on Earth during Bob 1's training, swirled with images from my imagination of Mac under Medeiros' thumb. But we were dealing with someone who was about to drop a metal meteor on a colony. Squeamishness was inappropriate. The drones approached the Brazilian ship, which was still drifting. We decided this was important enough to sacrifice all of Asgard's roamers, save 2 for rebuilding. This would be almost like a beach assault. Anything short of 100% casualties would be acceptable. The 2 drones came in as quickly as their drives could manage, braking with no leeway to arrive at rest just outside the rent in the enemy vessel. Cargo doors popped open and 8 roamers, including 2 of the big industrial-size units, stormed across the gap. The squad headed straight for the location of the replicant matrix. We knew the layout from Bob 1's first encounter with Medeiros, way back in Epsilon Eridani. The roamers encountered immediate resistance from the on-board roamers. The battle was short and furious. Medeiros was fighting for his life now. The standard roamers worked to protect the big units, as those would be needed for moving the matrix. Plasma cutters flashed and roamer parts floated around the enclosed space. The battle tilted in our direction once we realized that we could still use the big units. Anytime an enemy roamer got too close, an industrial unit lashed out with a leg. If the impact didn't disarticulate the victim outright, being bounced off a wall took it out of the fight for a few moments. Soon, we were down to 1 or 2 defenders, depending on how you counted body parts. Then the last roamer was dispatched, and "What the hell?" I exclaimed as all video feeds disappeared. Garfield poked at consoles. "The cargo drones are gone too. They've..." "Wait a moment, that's not true. I'm still getting telemetry from number 2. I'll try to activate a camera." Richards jerked in surprise in his video window as the event registered at the human timescale. "What happened?" Looks like Medeiros fell on his sword rather than be captured, Garfield said. He popped up a video window. This is what the second drone is showing. It's damaged, by the way. Won't be flying back on its own. The window showed the Brazilian vessel, or what was left of it. Pieces of spaceship spun and caught the sunlight as they receded. The ship was cut in two, and the two halves had been opened like flowers. He knew, I said. He knew he was finished. I don't know if he thought he was taking the victory away from us or thought we'd captured him and extract secrets. I shook my head. I will never understand Medeiros. I really hope this is the last time I have to deal with him. That's a little worrying, though, Garfield commented. I remember him being a bit on the pompous side at the first meeting with Bob 1. This time around, he never said a word, not even an exit monologue. I wonder what secrets he might feel the need to take to the grave. An excellent question, and the expression on Richards's and Hiroshi's faces showed the same concern that I felt. Never even saw him coming, Max said. He sat in my VR holding a coffee, feet up on a footstool. I remember talking to you about draining the swamps on Takama, and the next thing I know, I'm back in my default VR. Yep, he hit you square on. I raised my coffee. You can go over the videos at your leisure, but you missed some interesting times. Which aren't over, I'm afraid. Mac looked at his coffee, a frown forming. We have to assume Medeiros is still out there, in one form or another. We'll have to set up defenses, especially here and in Alpha Centauri. That's right, buddy. The colonies are okay with you diverting all printers to defensive items until you have a minimum level of ordnance. Yep, busters. Then a new vessel. Then some clones, then more printers. It'll be a while before I'm able to support the colonies directly. They'll do what they can with ground-side printers, Mac. Might be a good idea for them to have at least a small auto factory on each planet, just on principle. Mac nodded, staring into space. Just when we think we've got things figured out, the universe throws another curve. I grinned at him. Well, that's life. 31. Cleanup. Marcus, September 2215, Poseidon. The loss of their main fleet was a blow to the Council, but not a fatal one, as it turned out. Maybe I'd been underestimating the Council. Or maybe they had someone who was a terrific strategist. Whatever the reason, the Council kept coming up with surprises. The first surprise, although I suspected as much, was that they didn't have just the dozen cargo ships. Our first inkling of that came the day after our takeover of strategic ground assets.
We've got several cities under attack,
Gina announced, sitting up abruptly. Cal opened one eye. He was lying on a blanket getting some sun, and said, "With what?"
See for yourselves.
Gina held her tablet up. On it was shown a grainy, obviously blown-up image of a vessel. It appeared to my eye to be a variation on a version 3 Heaven vessel. Interesting. Looks like they've been reading BobNet, I said. I don't know why that didn't occur to me. I wouldn't normally think of it as strategic information. And yet the improvements the Bobs have been making in the Heaven design have been primarily for military purposes, Cal responded.
Plus,
Dinu added,
if they've been perusing BobNet, wouldn't they have found out about the cloaking?
I raised an eyebrow at Dinu, then exited the android and frame jack. A quick scan of recent BobNet blogs reassured me on that front. Returning to normal time, and to the android, I responded, "There's nothing but general descriptions, Dinu. With all the crap happening, Bill's just been transmitting plans directly to other Bobs. A bit of serendipity there." I didn't add that I'd just sent off a description of this situation to Bill. Hopefully, he would scan the blogs for any other potentially damaging information and remove it. Great. We'd just reinvented military secrecy. Gina, who had continued monitoring the situation, announced,
Anthor, Kaol, and Petarth are fending off missiles. It looks like whoever is still fighting has decided to go for a scorched earth policy. They're not even trying to board, just trying to knock the cities out of the sky.
She looked over at me. I nodded. Reluctant as I was to get directly involved, in this case, hundreds of lives were at stake. I ordered several squads of busters down from their hiding place on Pelias, the inner moon. It'll take a few minutes for them to get there, I said to Gina. Can you tell the cities that help is coming? Gina nodded and typed furiously for a few moments.
Done.
This is unbelievable. Dinu shook his head.
They're just trying to kill people. It's war, Dinu.
Gina replied.
It's not what we wanted, but apparently it's what the Council finds preferable to losing. Although I don't think they expected it to go this far either. Most of their recent moves look more like ad-libs than strategies.
She looked at me.
3 Council members still outstanding. This could be orders from any or all of them.
My money's on Brennan, though.
Cal glanced at each of us.
Some of the others at least seemed to be misguided but well-intentioned. He was all about the power.
Maybe. Let's get this done, then we can worry about assigning blame. I looked up as my heads-up display showed the busters coming up on the fields of battle. I ordered them to take out the attackers, if possible, by taking out critical systems, but otherwise by whatever worked. In seconds, the reports came back. 4 ships downed by clean reactor strikes, 3 more totally destroyed. The 2 remaining ships turned tail and fled. I took a moment to mourn the people I'd just killed. Very probably they were just following orders. But those orders had meant knocking a city containing several hundred civilians out of the sky. There was a point where following orders didn't cut it. I put a couple of cloaked drones on the tail of the escaping ships and recalled my surviving busters. If there had been any doubt in the Council's teeny minds that the cursed replicant was still extant, this engagement had removed it. The Council forces would be moving much more cautiously in the future. Tell the city defenders not to shoot down the surviving ships, I said to Gina. They might lead us back to the leadership. Gina nodded, and we settled back onto the grass. It was an odd juxtaposition. Revolutionary leaders in the middle of a shooting war, directing operations while lounging on a manicured lawn. I tracked the fleeing ships to a relatively small mat in the northern current, earmarked as an automated farming platform. Video images from the drones showed it to be anything but. A small but well-stocked airbase was probably the home of the Council fleet.
Well, that's not good.
Cal shook his head.
We'll have to check absolutely every mat on inventory now.
I grinned at him. Seems the Council has been planning this for a long time.
Or at least, planning for something.
He replied.
I can't see how they could have predicted your flying cities.
I nodded at that. This doesn't really look military, though. Security forces, maybe. Let's send in the roamers and a mop-up squad. Cal nodded. He and Gina started typing furiously while I worked on loading up the roamer squad into cargo drones. It took longer than expected to prepare for our assault. I was surprised to discover that with all the buzzing around and knocking out enemy ships and missiles, I was down to the dregs with busters and roamers. And without the system printers under my command, I couldn't immediately print more. In the end, Gina rounded up a squad of security people and we stormed the defenders the old-fashioned way. Sort of. I was still far happier with sacrificing an AMI than a human. Gina led the charge herself. The busters couldn't smash the buildings at speed. I didn't want to kill anyone. But they could smack gun emplacements hard enough to force defenders back.
Concentrate on all defenders on the west walls,
Gina's voice ordered over the comm system. Our security people set up a blistering fire which kept the defenders down.
Marcus, there's a weak spot on the wall at the southwest side. Can you get an explosive into there?
No explosives, Gina. Still too dangerous to print, but a weak spot was easy to target. A shipbuster came in at about 100 clicks and rammed the corner of the wall. 500 kilograms of steel completely did a number on it. Maybe a little too well. As usual, I seemed to be a little more enthusiastic with the ramming than was really required.
Thanks, Captain Crash. All units enter with caution.
I sent in some roamers as well, although all I had left were the little guys. The video feed showed a stunned, dust-covered group with no fight left in them. I think they're done, Gina. It's all mop-up. Gina, normally a somewhat dour, brooding person, was grinning unabashedly.
We got Brennan. No question that he ordered the attacks. We'll be debriefing the security people we captured, but I'll bet none of the other council members were involved in this.
Still, they'll all have to be dealt with. There will be trials. There will likely be convictions. Then there will be the question of what to do with them.
Cal shrugged.
My money's on menial labor.
Gina blew out a noisy breath.
Yeah, let's not count our chickens just yet. We don't know if there are any more loci of resistance. We may get individuals who keep fighting back, but hopefully we can contain the damage from that. As long as there are no more council members in the wind, though, I think that's it for anything organized.
The biggest thing will be accounting for all the remaining council members, then. Cal looked at me. Sorry, buddy, I don't have any special tricks for finding individuals on an entire planet. I gave him a crooked smile. Or off-planet, which is also a possibility.
Boy,
Cal rubbed the bridge of his nose with 2 fingers.
this really came down to the wire. If we'd had to fight just one more battle, we probably would have run out of assets. Do you have the printers back?
I nodded. And I've already started replacement construction, but it'll be a few days before anything pops out the other end. If we do find ourselves another fight, I looked pointedly at Gina, we'd probably better go for containment rather than a punch-up. Cal nodded.
Meanwhile, we also have a whole society to put back together. I hope you guys are okay with overtime.
We all grinned back at him. 32. Found. Bill, September 22-27, Epsilon Eridani. I stared at the readings, frankly disbelieving. I glanced over at Garfield. His wide eyes and slack jaw said it all. We'd slapped together a quick prototype based on the power core scans from the alien Hulk. A small prototype. According to our measurements, this kludged-together rig was outperforming our fusion reactors 5-1. Well, this explains a lot, Garfield finally said. Of course, we're not just going to rip out all our reactors and replace them with this stuff. Well, no, Garfield grinned at me. But a pilot project? At that moment, Will popped in.
Hey guys, what's this I hear about some others cargo vessels?
I motioned Will to a chair and materialized some images. The 2 Bobs who volunteered to survey the Delta Pavonis system chanced upon a couple of cargo vessels that had been taken out during the defensive engagement. They must have drifted right through the system. The others didn't pick up on it, and the derelicts would have just continued out into the cosmos if those 2 hadn't found them. Will leaned forward and poked at one of the images.
I think I remember that one, actually. It was almost cut in half.
I nodded. That unit is being broken down for materials. The guys are repairing the hole in the other one, and they've had the bright idea, genius actually, of putting mover plates around it instead of trying to figure out the other's drive system. Then they'll fly it back to Earth.
You could put 14 million people in that thing easily.
Will's voice was hushed. I laughed. You could misplace 14 million people in that thing. I made a show of feeling around in my pockets. Dang it, where did I put those colonists? Will grinned back at me.
Holy crap on a cracker. 1,500 ships or 1,500 trips, or one gigantic cargo carrier.
33. Project. Herschel, October 22-27, Delta Pavonis. Be careful what you wish for. Uh-huh. I was visiting Neil while we took a break. He draped himself across his chair sideways and was doing a good imitation of a boneless corpse. I could remember sitting like that when original Bob was a teenager. Neil had a couple of behaviors that seemed to harken back to Bob's adolescence. Friggin' hell, he finally moaned. Can we go back to being pond scum? Life was so much easier. I laughed and signaled Jeeves for a beer. Neil had a template for a particularly good ale, and I tried to make a point of having one when I was visiting. I sat down, took a drink, then called up the project plan. Well, we're a little ahead of schedule, buddy. You could afford to take a few milliseconds off. Oh, ha ha, you are too funny. Neil straightened up.
Well, at least we finally finished cutting up Hulk 2. Loading it all into Hulk 1's cargo bays is routine enough to be left to the AMIs. But building the mover plates... Yeah, I know. We weren't really anticipating having to deploy our printers when we came out here. It's a pain. We grinned at each other and said in unison, "But it's a good pain." Anyway, I continued. Mood is in a half hour. You might want to get organized. Neil scowled at me, then pulled up his files. He muttered something about slavery, but got to work. The moot was crowded, but that was normal these days. There had been a problem with despondency for a few months after the loss of Delta Pavonis 4, but we'd bounced back. Now the Bobs were more determined than ever to deal out some payback. Neil and I picked a spot close to the podium. Normally we'd be at the back, as befitted Pond Scum, but we were now project leaders. Of course, we were also project workers, project gophers, and project janitorial staff, but who's counting? We would be expected to give a status report on the Derelicts project. Bill mounted the podium, held the air horn above his head, and gave the traditional blat. The audience greeted him with the usual catcalls and boos. I stayed silent and noticed that Neil was more reticent than usual as well. It was much harder to be an agitator when we were standing up front. Bill looked around the audience, waiting for the commentary to die down. When he had quiet, he began to speak. I'm going to start off with a bombshell. Starting 20 days ago, a number of our monitoring drones around GL-877 were attacked. Per their standing instructions, they self-destructed immediately. In the last 2 instances, the drones weren't attacked, but chased. This news was met with gasps from the audience. Neil and I stared at each other, bug-eyed with shock, and he mouthed, "They know." Bill waited a moment for the chatter to die down. We figure the Delta Pavonis harvesting expedition reported back to the others' homeworld, and they correctly concluded that they were under surveillance. Based on the attempt to capture the last 2 drones, they may have surmised that we have a technological advantage of some kind. A hologram of the GL-877 system popped up in the air, showing the location of the surveillance drones around the system. Bill made a gesture with his hand, and one by one, drones were replaced by small explosion graphics. We're reconfiguring that as we lose drones, our coverage will get spotty. We're biasing them toward the near side of GL-877 to catch any expeditions coming our way. We're also introducing some randomness in their positions, just to make it more difficult for the others to find the drones. There haven't been any new attacks in the last week, so that may be working. And Mario will be replacing the drones on a priority basis, but will still be deficient for a few years. Neil edged up to me. Something smells. What? There's something about this scenario that bothers me. Why'd they stop? Because they realized they couldn't catch the drones? Because we randomized the locations? Nope, not sufficient. Neil opened his mouth to add something, but at that moment, Bill decided to introduce us. Now, you've all been hearing about the Derelict project. Herschel and Neil are here today to give you their first official update. Bill gestured toward us. I could feel myself blushing furiously as we mounted the podium. I looked around at the sea of Bobs, and my voice locked up. Neil, familiar with my stage fright, picked up smoothly. On a recon flight, we found a couple of others' cargo vessels drifting out of the Delta Pavonis system. One was pretty much totaled, but the other was almost intact, with damage limited to AI and drive systems. We were able to reactivate the power core. There's a separate report on what we've been able to figure out about the technology. Neil turned to me and gestured. He'd given me just the right amount of time to get it together. I picked up the thread smoothly. We've broken down the totaled derelict and have been using the materials to do repairs on the Bellerophon. The assembled Bobs picked up on our chosen name, and we received whistles and whoops of approval. When the approbation died down, I continued. Rather than trying to rebuild the drive, we're just manufacturing mover plates. Bill figures 24 will be enough to fly the whole thing to Earth. We've loaded the extra material from the other derelict into the hold, and we'll be manufacturing stasis pods during the voyage. I looked around for Riker, but couldn't see him, so I looked at Bill. We're thinking that if Earth would shift some manufacturing capacity into stasis pods, we could move a lot of people in one shot. I glanced around at the crowd.
4 or 5 dozen versions of my face looked back at me. Smiles, nods, frowns of concentration predominated. Okay, not so bad. Bob's were not subtle. If our presentation had been less than interesting, we'd know it. Questions? Bill said. Bedlam erupted. Okay, really not bad. Neil leaned closer to me. Isn't it nice to be important? I'm having second thoughts, thanks. Bill pointed to someone and the chaos quieted. Thor stepped forward. How confident are you of the alien power core? I opened my mouth to reply, but Neil jumped in. It works fine, just as dependable as one of our own and a lot more powerful. I glared at him and whispered, You lie like a log. Shut up, you. How many pods do you think you can make? Thor continued. We have enough material to build a pod for every human being alive, Neil answered. Just not enough time. In the 3.6 years subjective trip time, we figure we can make just over 5 million of them. Bill turned and spoke to someone. Will, how many could you put together at your end? Riker stepped forward. No more than a couple of million. We're working in non-relativistic time, but on the other hand, we don't have piles of refined materials just sitting there. We have to salvage every kilogram of metal, and the pickings are getting thinner. It's starting to slow colony ship production, as a matter of fact. The conversation descended into comparisons of critical paths, differing ramp-up strategies, result domains, and other, even less interesting things. I eyed Neil, and he nodded. As casually as possible, we sidled away from the debate and toward the bar. No one noticed our departure. I leaned against a rail with a beer in my hand and grinned at Neil. We're important. Yeah, when they notice we're gone, I'll concede. Meanwhile, he raised his beer in a toast. Gotta love moots. 34. Kidnapping. Bob, September 22-24, Delta Eridani, Eden. I was sitting in the sun with Buster, watching him casually work a piece of flint, when the Deltan came running up. He bent over, gasping for breath for a few moments, then straightened.
Archimedes has been grabbed. I think it was some guys from Caerleon. Must have been.
I leaped to my feet and almost yelled at the runner. Have you told Donald? Anyone else? He nodded, still gasping.